The theme of our meeting is moving forward. And our guiding verse from Philippians 3, verse 13, Paul is laser focused on the race to reach the goal and the finish line. He doesn't dwell on his failures, but he looks forward to the victory lap when he will see the face of Jesus. Remember that he was Saul who persecuted the church. He played a part in the stoning of Stephen, but he didn't let guilt or shame cripple him. He didn't let it haunt him or trip him up in the present. Brothers, we are all called to be like Christ, but we continue to make mistakes. Our flesh pulls us towards sin and away from the prize. Paul recognized this shortfall, so he exhorted the Philippians and future Bible readers to use their spiritual muscles to move forward in their Christian lives. How about you, brothers? How are you running the race? How are you dealing with our present reality? The world right now is much different than before. As our lives and economy slowly open up, we have a semblance of normalcy. But the pandemic, the economy, world issues, and the recent local election have greatly affected the way we live. We don't know what's normal anymore. Even how we serve and do our ministry has changed. It takes great effort just to set up a meeting like this. I'd like to take this opportunity to honor some brother site leaders who have started their hybrid face-to-face meetings for some time now. Special mention to Emil Ormita of Patwis Makati and Doc Johnny Perez of the Call Room. They have faithfully conducted multiple prayer meetings amid this COVID surge we are going through in Manila. Brothers, you inspire us all to step up in our service. Thank you for rising high the standard banners of our Lord. When I see that what these sites are doing, it makes me long for what we had before. But the world and the flesh seem to keep pushing and pushing us away from our goal. If we give in, if we fail to move forward, we won't reach the finish line. The devil just keeps pushing us back, moving the line, trying to get us to settle for things that Jesus already shed his precious blood to free us from. Satan will ask us to settle for things that clearly violate our better covenant and better promise that we have in Christ. Do not settle for anything less than God's best. We do not need to tolerate this. When the devil pushes us back, we need to be immovable instead. Sometimes you just have to draw a line in the sand and make a stand. Like our brothers and sisters at Patwis Makati and the Call Room. Refuse the devil to push you back. Refuse to settle for what the world and the flesh has to offer. So we can move forward and run the race to our upward call. Jesus offers a better covenant and a better promise. Go after his ultimate victory in every area of your life. Drawing a line in the sand. This will be the topic for our discussion this afternoon. The inspiration for this talk was taken from the book of Daniel. Their experience is similar to what we are going through right now. In 587 BC, Jerusalem was attacked by the Babylonian Empire. The city and the temple were plundered and burned. The Jews were taken away from their home and relocated to Babylon. They became exiles. They became a minority, surrounded by a new ruler, a new culture, with new gods. Does that sound familiar, brothers? How did they react? Some chose to resist Babylon by rebelling or withdrawing. Others just gave in. They adapted to the Babylonian way of life and accepted these new gods as their own. You might think that these are their only two options, but the prophet Jeremiah told them to do something totally different and surprising. In Jeremiah 29, verses 4 to 7, he told them to settle in, to build houses, to plant gardens, to grow families, and most surprisingly, to seek the well-being of Babylon, even to pray to the Lord on their behalf. It's not compromise, not revolt. The story of Daniel explores this third option. Daniel was one of the Israelites taken into Babylonian exile. Because he had royal heritage and an education, He was recruited along with some of his friends to serve the king of Babylon. You would think that they would compromise, or perhaps they would gain the king's trust and take him down from the inside. But instead, they took the third way and took Jeremiah's advice. They served the king of Babylon, taking on Babylonian names and even clothing style. It would appear that they were giving up their heritage. But as you read on, the story focuses on moments when they draw the line. They chose faithfulness to their God and resisted the influence of Babylon. For example, when they are commanded to bow down to the idol of Babylon and give allegiance to the king as he were a god, they refuse to do so. This is where they draw the line. This is where you see their true loyalty. It requires them to critique the Babylon's idolatry of power, its arrogance, and its injustice. But they do so by non-violent means, by laying down their lives. And so because of their faithfulness, God vindicates Daniel and his friends. They would continue to serve Babylon and seek its well-being, but their loyalty was always to God. This is what Jeremiah was envisioning, the way of the exile, a combination of loyalty and also of subversion. But still, they were exiles. Daniel and his friends longed to go home. In fact, he believed that God is going to send a ruler to bring down Babylon and create a true kingdom of peace. At first, he thought this would occur in his lifetime. But then he had a dream that after Babylon would come another oppressive empire, then another, then another. Babylon did eventually fall, and the Israelites did get back to home. But by now, they are ruled by Babylon's successors. So they maintained a mindset of an exile, waiting for their true home to come to them. They continued the same practice of loyalty and subversion to any new versions of Babylon that came along. This leads us to the time of Jesus. The empire of his day was Rome, ruled by Caesar. Some Israelites wanted to resist, while others gave in and adopted Roman culture and its gods. But Jesus followed the third option and continued the subversive loyalty of Daniel. Like when he said, it's fine to pay your taxes to Caesar, give him back your coins. But then he said, don't make the mistake of taking Caesar as your God. It's only God who deserves your total life and allegiance. He taught his followers to love and even bless their enemies. But he spoke out against the corrupt leaders of Jerusalem. He critiqued their idolatry of power. He got arrested, and it cost him his life. But God vindicated him by raising him from the dead as the true king of the nations, the king that Daniel had hoped for. Jesus promised that one day his kingdom would prevail. So until then, we, his followers, are living in a type of exile. That is why the Apostle Peter called the followers of Jesus foreigners and exiles. He told them to respect the authorities of whatever place they happen to live and to honor all the people. But then he reminds us that this is not our true home. We are still living in Babylon. In the Bible, Babylon has become a symbol that describes any human institution that demands allegiance to its idolatrous redefinition of good and evil. So actually, brothers, we are all living and working in Babylon right now. The question is, how do we seek the well-being of Babylon while my allegiance is to someone greater? As followers of Jesus, we are called to live in that tension between loyalty and subversion. If we are to give our total allegiance to God's kingdom, how should we relate to the governments and power structures of the present day? How to live in the world, but not be of the world. That's the way of the exile. Brothers, let me ask you this. Have you ever had a tough decision to make? I'm talking about a situation where you either had to draw a line or compromise what you believe, your ethics, your morals. Maybe it's something as simple like whether or not you should watch a particular R-rated movie, or maybe it's about your job, or a friend, or a loved one, or maybe that's something to do with your finances. I'll give you an example. Here's a tough choice. Who here are into superhero comics? Sino yung mga taga Marvel? Sino pala Marvel, pala DC? Yeah. For those online, use the heart icon for Marvel and thumbs up for those from DC. And you can put that in the chat box or just I know Bobby's a DC fan. He mentioned to me one time that he would follow the DC series like Flash and the Arrow on TV with his kids. But one time, while watching an episode of Supergirl, there was an explicit kissing scene between two women in a homosexual relationship. Bobby knew that this was not a relationship that was acceptable to God the Father, nor was it the type of relationship that he wanted his kids to think was acceptable to their papang either. So he put his foot down and told his kids that they were not going to follow that series anymore. Then he started to watch Darna instead. Brothers, at some point in our lives, we will face a situation where we have to decide whether or not we are going to do the right thing, even if those around us don't. Let's see how the story of Daniel offers wisdom for navigating the way of the exile. Daniel found himself in a compromising situation. The Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, took captives back to the king. They were snatched from a strict Jewish upbringing and forced to assimilate into a secular society. Many of the captives did whatever the Babylonians told them to do. They gave in and concealed their beliefs and ethics so they could fit in and stay out of harm's way. But Daniel didn't. He drew a line in the sand that he refused to cross. In many ways, Daniel proved his obedience, even if it meant losing most of his Jewish identity. They did change his name, how he looked, how he spoke. But when it came to violating himself, he refused to comply. The food that the king served did not meet the restrictions that Daniel knew would honor God. So instead of compromising his faith, he drew a line. In verse 8 of chapter 1, notice that Daniel was respectful in his actions when he requested not to defile himself. He didn't slam his fist on the table or insist on being allowed to eat different food. No. He requested the eunuch's permission. As a result, God gave Daniel favor. In verse 9, God's favor persuaded the eunuch to agree to Daniel's request. Then in verse 20, sure enough, after 10 days of eating vegetables, Daniel and his friends looked healthier than all the other boys. They were also smarter. When they were brought before the king for examination, no one looked in better shape than them. God gave Daniel favor, but there's a catch. He only gave him favor after Daniel drew his line. Daniel remained faithful, and he did not compromise his relationship to God. The Bible calls people who compromise their faith lukewarm Christians. You are either on fire for Christ or not at all. The world calls them hypocrites. They go to church on Saturday or a leaders' meeting on Saturday and appear to be good Christians. But after the services are over, by the time they get into their cars or they press that leave meeting button, they are already back in the world. They are yelling at other drivers during traffic or opening not safe for work sites on the internet. By Monday, they are stealing small items from the office supply room. They gossip about what so-and-so did last night, or they go home at night to someone they sleep with, but they're not married. Everyone else is doing it, so what's the big deal? In these days, it's hard not to see how Babylon is taking over those who follow Christ. We are being led further and further astray by the powers of darkness. And sadly, there are fewer and fewer willing to draw a line and stand for their faith. Let's see what we can learn from Daniel. First takeaway, he was faithful. Though he was in a hostile and foreign land under strict authority, he stayed faithful to his teachings and what he believed. He refused to compromise on his convictions. He avoided temptation by fixing his eyes on God. Keeping his relationship with God strong through prayer was a priority of Daniel's daily routine. Chapter 6, verse 10 states that he knelt down and praised God 3 times a day, just as he always did. He showed that his relationship with God was the very thing that brought him wisdom, strength, and happiness in all circumstances. He trusted God to continue to take care of him, even in the face of the schemes of his enemies. Brothers, what are you doing to stand firm in faith so that when times of crisis come, your trust in God does not falter? Faithfulness comes from a place of trust and loyalty. Hebrew 11 verse 1 says, "Now faith is a confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." As Christians, it's important to be faithful to God. It's one thing to simply believe in Him, but another to be faithful to Him. Being faithful in small decisions made them ready to face big trials that came later. Second takeaway, he showed integrity amidst temptations. In the opening chapter, Daniel chose not to defile himself with royal food and wine. The manner which he chose to protect himself from the indulgences of the Babylonian Empire is an example of all that all leaders should follow. Daniel and his friends resolved not to give in to the temptation of taking food and drink considered unclean to Jewish law. They made a resolute effort to remain faithful to their culture and to their Lord. Faithfulness to the Lord, despite temptation, is an essential quality of Christian leaders. Brothers, there's no shortage of temptations and stumbling blocks that the enemy will use to take Christian leaders. It's imperative that leaders follow their example by not taking these seemingly innocent temptations to take hold. One key element of Daniel's success in this area is the use of accountability. Had Daniel taken this initiative on his own, the temptations would have been overwhelming. Brothers, to prove faithfulness in a culture that is hostile to the Lord, it is essential that you do not isolate yourselves. Gather a band of brothers and sisters together, seek their faithfulness and obedience to the Lord. In this way, Christian leaders must lead by example. In the same way that a leader must not lift oneself up with pride, one must not depend on oneself, but rather remain completely dependent on the Lord. As Proverbs 3 verse 5 to 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not with your understanding. In your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight." Daniel, as any other hero in the Bible, demonstrates complete dependence on the Lord. When King Darius took over Babylon, his leaders recommended that none shall worship anyone other than Darius. The enemies, knowing that Daniel was faithful to his God, knew that they could convict him and cast him to the lion's den. But Daniel, knowing that remaining faithful to the Lord would result to being cast to the lion's den, responded by spending even more prayer time with God. We read this earlier in chapter 6, verse 10. When Daniel was threatened for his faithfulness to God, he responded with growing intensity and dependence on the Lord. Daniel was convicted for his actions, but God rewarded his faithfulness, allowing him to survive the lion's den. It is due to Daniel's complete dependence on God that God allowed him to endure. And it's the responsibility of all Christian leaders to exhibit this same faithfulness to the Lord as Daniel did. All Christians are called to this covenant fidelity to the Lord. And it's a burden of the leaders that God has established to set this example of faithfulness that others can follow. Brothers, Let us remain totally dependent on God. Daniel knew that he had to deal with this new normal. He knew that things weren't going to change anytime soon. He did whatever he was told to do and compromised on some things to keep him out of trouble. But when someone told him to do something that wasn't okay, something that would defile him, something that would profane his soul before God, he put his foot down. He drew his line. It wasn't until after he said, I'll do this, but I won't do that, that God granted him favor. Too often, Christians ask God for a favor in a situation but they just won't draw their line. They're doing just fine in the land of Babylon. And the world is pleased because they don't have an endpoint. There's no line, no conflict, and everyone's happy. Yet when they ask for God's favor, if not outright expect it, they are surprised when God doesn't fulfill their requests. Brothers, there has to come a time when Christians must decide who their God is. Is it a cultural God or the God of all creation? Jesus said, we cannot serve two masters. We must make a choice. Either we draw a line and say, this is how far I will go, or we give in to keep the Babylonians happy. In conclusion, let us follow the example of Daniel, who through adversity is one of our Bible heroes and models of faithfulness, integrity, and total dependence on God. Brothers, it's time to draw our line in the sand. Now, before I end, I have some time for group discussion. We'll post a reflection guide in the chat box, or you can take a screenshot as well.